I knew in that moment I was going to be an atheist, which just horrified me because I didn't have the proper clothing. I didn't have shag carpeting. I didn't have, I wasn't into pornography. I didn't want to be a pornographer.
Say absolute certainty one more time, I dare you. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. Most of the content on my channel is supported by generous patrons, but made available for free to the entire world. If you support that, please consider adding your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates. This clip, however, is from one of the many programs that I do on YouTube on The Line. And if you liked it, feel free to visit, like, subscribe, and watch The Line Network live. Thank you. Set aside the political turmoil a little bit for the next little bit here and see if we can have some God-based calls with Mr. Deity.
There we go.
Let's try it. Clay is calling from Ohio. Clay's a theist that says, what made you choose atheism as a worldview? Hey, Clay, how are you?
I'm good. How are you guys doing? Thanks for having me on the show.
Sure.
Good. Hi, Clay.
I will say this might shortcut the entire call, but atheism isn't a worldview and it wasn't a choice. Beliefs aren't a choice. And so when I realized that I had no good reason to believe there was a God, that means I'm an atheist, a non-theist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Good clarification. My question, I guess, to revise would be more of like what prompted, encouraged, or facilitated your deconversion or deconstruction process, if you wouldn't mind going into that at all.
Brian, you want to start?
Well, I grew up Mormon, not Christian, and I've told this story a number of times. It was a weird one. I used to work with and for Dennis Prager of PragerU fame. He and I were very good friends back in the late 80s, early 90s, and through until like 2007, 2008. I had written a piece called Why Mormons Aren't Christians, which he edited for me, and then he encouraged me to write a book about the Mormon view of God. And so I started doing that, but he had also taught me another thing, which I don't know that he anymore, which was always know the other side, always know the other side. And I realized that I didn't know the other side. So I started studying atheism and atheist arguments and suddenly found myself terrified because I didn't want to be an atheist. I didn't, Mormonism is it's totalitarian I don't say that in a derogatory way. It's just every ounce of your life is taken up with Mormonism. It's very invasive. And if that works for you, that's great. But I realized I was going to lose a lot. I was going to lose so many friends, business contacts at the time if I left the church and all that kind of stuff. So I went to Dennis in a panic. You got to help me. You got to help me. You got to help me. We sat down and talked, and then I realized he really didn't know the other side. And I knew in that moment I was going to be an atheist, which just horrified me because I didn't have the proper clothing. I didn't have shag carpeting. I didn't have, I wasn't into pornography. I didn't want to be a pornographer or a communist. So that was my journey. The journey all the way out is a little more detailed because it took me probably a year at least from that point to sending in my letter to the Mormon church saying, take me off your records.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you mentioned, go ahead, Matt. I'm sorry.
I'm going to do mine really quick. My journey's simple. I wanted to be a pornographer and communist. No, I'm just kidding. I was the shortest version. At the age of 5, I walked down the aisle at Gasland Baptist Church to accept Jesus into my heart, surrounded by a family of Southern Baptists and some off Catholics. I was a sincere, committed fundamentalist Christian until I joined the Navy at 18. I was in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Saturday for other stuff. Then I went in the military and became less involved, but I thought that God had wanted me to be a preacher, as did my family, as did members of my church, but I was terrified of that, so I ran off to the Navy. Then I went and worked in the tech industry. Then I lost my job and thought God was punishing me. So I said, okay, God, if you want me to be a preacher, I will. And I spent a year and a half in pretty serious prayer and study and found that I did not have good reasons for my belief. And then I spent time studying philosophy and epistemology and other world religions to figure out what beliefs might possibly be true and how could we tell the difference? And that's how I ended up here.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, totally makes sense. Mr. Deity, you mentioned that there were like particular arguments that you, like when you started exploring, after your internal crisis, that there were particular arguments that you found compelling, kind of atheistic arguments. Were there any in particular that like kind of come to mind that really maybe put the nail in the coffin for you?
For me, it was more about learning a different way of thinking. There were all kinds of arguments. There was one book in particular that really, really hit me. It was called The Atheist Debater's Handbook, which I just went and got from a local library. And he takes on the pro arguments that theists make, which I thought were so compelling. He takes them on and just shows you one by one how they don't really work. And I mean, literally everything. I thought I had it all, figured out. And that book just completely made me rethink everything. But it wasn't, I don't know that there was anything in particular. There were specific things for Mormonism in particular, because I became an atheist before I left Mormonism. And I thought that was okay because Mormonism doesn't have a big G God. There's no the God. Mormonism, the God of Mormonism is a God in a series of God knows how many, pun intended. And so I thought I was okay with the not being a big G theist. And I tried to hold on to my Mormonism for a little while, but then I took the same kind of look at Mormonism, and that crumbled pretty quickly. And this was right around the time also, I would say 90, 91, 92, where the DNA evidence was coming out and making it clear that the Native Americans were not, in fact, Hebrews, as the Book of Mormon claimed. And so there were pretty easy things on that end.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. And then you mentioned, Matt, that it was kind of following a job loss that you started to kind of explore and ask about pastoral positions and research a little bit more about the atheistic points of view. So it sounds like both of you guys are saying that there maybe were some positive arguments for atheism, but then also just a dismantling of your previous world points of view regarding God. Is that accurate? Is that kind of what you guys are saying?
So kind of. So atheism, it fits into two buckets, the soft or weak atheist position or the non-theist position, which is I am not convinced a God exists. And then there's the strong atheist position of I am convinced no gods exist. I may or may not fit into both categories depending on certain definitions, but the minimal category is that you're no longer convinced or you are not currently convinced that God exists. And so there isn't an argument for that position. That is the result of rejecting a position. And so for the broader strokes, I mean, I think Mormonism is absolutely one of the most obviously ridiculous man-made invented religions. It's modern, everything else. It's right up there with Scientology. It's a toss-up as to which one I find more ridiculous. But I just was like, oh, but Christianity, that's been around for a long time, and I'm a part of that, and there's all these other things. And then I found out there isn't good evidence for any of this, and there isn't empirical evidence to support any of these notions. And the Christian apologists, both with regard to creationism and other things, are engaged in fallacious reasoning and reaching conclusions based on gods of the gaps or not knowing. And so once I figured all that out, I said, oh, I'm not a Christian. I can't be a Christian, but I still, there's got to be some kind of God. There must be some first cause somewhere else. And then I continued going through those things. And it turns out that it is a web of confusion built on anecdotes and fallacies. And so the position is the God claims have not met their burden of proof. And until they do, I have no choice but to reject them.
Okay. That makes sense. I've heard you. I know that you've, and I kind of have grasped that's your position in the past, just from the stuff that I have seen. I know that you've answered this question before, so forgive me, but I can't remember or find the answer. What evidence would be sufficient for each of you guys individually, hypothetically speaking? Obviously, that evidence doesn't currently exist. If it did, you guys would believe. But more so, if you could fabricate a scenario in which you would believe, what would that look like for you guys?
Well, first, it would depend on the God that we're talking about. But my answer to this used to be the same as some other people, and I think it's glib and dismissive. So here's my answer now, and has been for a decade and a half, probably. I have no idea what evidence would convince me. I don't know, and I'm not convinced that anybody could know, because essentially I would be claiming that I have the capacity to tell the difference between something I don't understand, like a God, and something else I don't understand, like an incredibly advanced technology or a mystery where there's, not an explanation. But for the people who are proposing,
absolutely,
but for the people who are proposing that there is a God, for example, the God that I grew up with, the Southern Baptist Christian God of, this church and my family, God absolutely knows whether or not I believe. God absolutely knows whether or not I've made an honest effort for this. I couldn't possibly fool God. God should know exactly what it would take to convince me. And God, if he's worthy of being called God at all, should be able to produce exactly what it would take to convince me. And because those things have not happened, either that God does not exist or that God doesn't want me to know he exists. Either way, it's not my problem. I can't solve it at all. So it's up to God to do something. I don't know what it could take.
Yeah, no, it all totally makes sense. And then, Mr. D, I definitely want to get your response as well. But real quick, I just want to respond. So when it comes to your first answer, what evidence would it take to convince you that the I don't know answer, because it makes total sense because of what you're describing. Hey, like, how am I supposed to differentiate between what I just simply don't understand yet versus what would actually be a God? I guess my question to that is, what does that possibly indicate what one's preconceived decision is before looking at the two scenarios? So in other words, if I say, look, I see a possible God, or it could be there could be a possible scientific explanation, I don't know yet, I'm going to be non-convinced or stand in my position, whether it's theistic or atheistic. Wouldn't that still kind of be determined by the preconceived worldview? And so in other words, so if I am atheist looking at those two scenarios going into it, and I am presented with, quote unquote, sufficient evidence, but I make the decision to say instead, hey, this could be a materialistic explanation, I just don't have the information yet. Would that not be representative of maybe the bias or preconceived notion going into that analysis? Does that make sense?
Yeah. First of all, when you say there's the two scenarios, those aren't the only two. But I mean, theism and atheism, yes, that's it, mutually exclusive. The problem is the bias that I have is towards truth and sound epistemology. I don't have a bias for or against God. As a matter of fact, when I started this, I was a believer desperately trying to demonstrate the truth of the existence of God to my atheist roommate and to others at the time. And it wasn't just that I failed to do it, it was that everybody failed to do that. And so if somebody came up and said, hey, here's a scenario, and we don't know what the explanation is, but we've got these bits of evidence, and these things have convinced people that a God is a candidate explanation for this. What do you say? Well, my answer is A, I don't know, but B, I don't know how people determined that a God is even a candidate explanation. The possibility of a God has not been demonstrated, let alone the probability. And in all of these discussions, nobody has ever presented anything, even in the ballpark of strong evidence, to make me go, could that be a God? And none of it. It is just, oh, here's a mystery, you're going to solve it with a God. Well, that's not a solution. We solve things, we explain things in terms of other things we understand. There's no solution in appealing to a mystery. You can't solve a mystery by appealing to a mystery.
Okay. Are you saying the God hypothesis just isn't a possibility?
I've never heard a God hypothesis that is testable. And that means that primarily they are unfalsifiable and they don't have evidential support. And at no point has anybody demonstrated that a God is possible and should be considered a candidate explanation. But I want to get Mr. Deity back in here because he was going to answer.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. My apologies.
Yeah, By the way, I love Matt's answer, and I've talked about it a lot on my own shows. I think it's really compelling. I actually have other criteria though, because it's based on, particularly if we're talking about the Christian God, I want to see transcendence and I want to see the supernatural. First of all, I don't know why Jesus isn't just here with us. Why isn't he just still here with us? He could be here if he had gone to every nation in the world and introduced himself and told them of the gospel, kind of like what the Mormons said he did. And we had records from the Chinese from the year 35, where he showed up there, and he showed up in Norway and in the Americas and all over the place to prove his existence so that we could all believe in him and be saved. That would be amazing. But I just transcended things like simple things that could have been done while Jesus was here. He's the all-knowing, all-loving God of the universe, and he can't. Nowhere does it appear that he decided to tell everybody, don't have any more slaves and treat women equally, or little basic things like that would have been truly transcendent for that time in his age. Don't do these terrible things. If he had been able to warn us, maybe tell us something about the germ theory of disease. Or finally, there are things that Jesus said believers would be able to do. That they would be able to do greater works than he had done. And he did some pretty great stuff. But even if believers could just do the works that he did, if they could go out and regularly heal the blind, when Jesus said 2 or more are gathered in my name, ask anything you want and you got it. If people could do that in the particular name of a particular God, I'd be pretty freaking impressed. I don't know that I'd totally swallow it. I would wonder, but yeah, go ahead, Matt.
No, I'm gonna get back to Clay real quick. Also, Clay, I just wanted to say that while Mr. Deity's talking about Jesus, I understand that there's plenty of people who are theistic that don't know or care anything at all about Jesus or Christianity. It's just these are the ones, Christianity, Mormonism, are the ones we're closest to. If we're talking about something more like some abstract, creator God or whatever else, then obviously we can set aside the Jesus stuff. But Clay, what do you believe in? Why do you think we should also believe it, or do you?
Yeah, so I am a theist, and I'll get into the specifics a little bit later. I will. I want to make some clarifications first. I do want to maybe posit, and I know that you would likely disagree with this, so I mean this with all due respect, that we all do live for something, and that whether we say we do or not, right, as soon as we get out of bed in the morning, walk out of the house, we're making an assertion that a particular way to live and or worldview, whether I'm using that word incorrectly or not, I'm not sure, but we're making an assertion that it's true. And so I guess the ultimate question that I
completely disagree.
Okay. Go ahead.
When I wake up in the morning, I mean, I don't know what you mean by we all live for something. I think our reasons for persisting can vary, but also I think there are people who continue to persist not because they have something to live for, but because they're afraid of not living or afraid of annihilation. But also, you said whether we say we do or not, every day we're making an assertion that a particular way to live or a worldview is true. I'm not convinced that's true. I think that certainly there are people who would say, ooh, I have this worldview and it's true. There are other things where, for example, my worldview is not, there are no gods and that's true, therefore I must live by it. My worldview is skepticism and humanism. And so those are the reasons that I continue to seek out knowledge and understanding of the world. And if it happens that there's a God, that's fine. And if, we'll deal with that.
Right. So I guess in this particular instance, would skepticism and humanism not be reasons to live or persist? For your particular
but I'm not,
case, I guess.
My position isn't saying that those things are necessarily true. It's saying that those views, as they stand right now, and they are subject to revision, make my life better and apparently make the lives of other people better. And I have a goal of making lives better. And nobody has to have that goal, but yeah.
Absolutely. So I hear you. I guess my question is when you live as though skepticism and humanism is true, even though you're not making the verbal assertion or vocal assertion, is that not in and of itself a type of assertion? Whether it could be later falsified or not, right? As of now, that's the thing. No?
No, I'm saying this is the best thing I've found. And as soon as someone convinces me of better, I'll change.
Okay. I got you.
I'm reluctant to say it's an assertion of truth, but I will say that in all the years I've done this, I've talked about how I'm a skeptic and a humanist, and virtually no one has made any attempt to show where skepticism or humanism fail.
Are you guys there? Did you cut out?
Yeah, we're still here. Did you lose us?
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, you've lived all your life as a skepticist and humanist, and then what was the last thing?
Not all my life. What I'm saying, all the time that I've been advocating for skepticism, humanism, and atheism, the only thing that the overwhelming majority of theists want to address is whether or not there's a God. They don't tend to address the skepticism or the humanism at all. And at no point has somebody made a case for why here's something that is in fact better than skepticism or humanism, other than their assertions that their version of God is, or their version of morality is in line with God, not that it's necessarily better.
Okay, I got you. You made a statement there at the very end that nobody at any point in time has provided, information that their assertion is true or convincing, or I guess maybe evidential or evidence-based. I guess the other caveat that I'd put forth is that evidence isn't that which we personally find convincing. It's that which points to a particular position or assertion being true. And so you could have maybe five different scientists put forth, hypotheses about a particular, or theories about a particular hypothesis, four of which agree, one of which disagrees, but that doesn't necessarily mean, or is not convinced. That doesn't mean that the other four assertions are not true, right?
Yeah, you're changing.
Don't have evidence to support them. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You're changing terminology, and you said they could have five theories about a hypothesis. No, that's not what a theory is or how a theory works in science. A theory is the graduation point in science. It is the current best explanation supported by independent investigation, peer review, et cetera. You're not going to have five scientific theories about a hypothesis or an observed fact. You may have multiple hypotheses, and then whichever ones are testable and falsifiable, you then begin to explore in order to determine which of them, if any, are the current best supported by evidence.
No, yes. So that maybe it's just semantical error there. But so I guess my main point, though, is that whether or not the single scientist that's off to the side is convinced of the other theories, assertions, whatever, or the hypothesis doesn't determine whether or not there is or is not evidence for that hypothesis, I guess is what I'm getting at.
Correct. And I've never said anything remotely like that.
Okay, fair. Yeah, I guess my interpretation, so when, say, and the reason I make these clarifications before I put forth the evidence that I would want to talk about is because the temptation can be for, say, somebody who's interested in hearing the evidence to kind of sit back on the judge's chair while somebody else puts forth or posits evidence, and the individual in the judge's chair just kind of smacks away the evidence and says, I'm not convinced, or that it's not, or they'll just say, label it as not being evidence. And
not being sufficient evidence. Not being sufficient evidence to warrant a claim.
Right.
Okay, so we've answered questions and danced around for 22 minutes. Are you going to get to what you believe and why we should believe it?
Right, for them to personally be convinced, which is kind of the subjective component that I wanted to highlight before going into it. But yes, so what I find kind of interesting as far as I'm sure you're already aware of it, but it's emerging, is not just near-death experiences, but verifiable near-death experiences. So instances in which people lose consciousness, sight, vision, heartbeat is no longer being registered, brain activity is no longer being registered. Time passes and elapses in a way that would be consistent with them being diagnosed as clinically dead in most instances. And then they return with information about what transpired in the material realm during that time frame. And that is confirmed by physicians, nurses, staff that witnesses the event. Then it's documented in case reports like Lloyd Rudy. so on and so forth. So I guess my question for you would be, what would be the materialistic explanation for that phenomenon?
So let's just assume that everything you said is accurate, which is not the case, because it's leaping to some conclusions. One is that when somebody comes back from being unconscious, that their brain is remembering things rather than filling in details. Another one is that the proposed experience of what occurred while they were unconscious is something that is extraordinary or anything else, because the brain is a bizarre instrument that can do all kinds of stuff and let you know when you're, asleep, that your alarm's going off or whatever. But let's just assume everything was true. Let's just also say that we have no materialistic explanation currently for that. What conclusion can we then draw in the absence of a materialistic explanation?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so I think this is where it kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation. This is where you have those two possibilities where you can either put forth,
no, sir.
I don't know.
No, sir. Listen.
Okay.
If we acknowledge that something has happened, which I'm not willing to do, but let's just acknowledge X has happened.
Right.
And we both agree that we do not currently have a materialistic explanation for X. The question is very simple. What conclusion can we draw?
So you can't draw a firm conclusion to answer your question, but you can put forth.
I didn't ask for firm. I don't know why it is that when I ask a simple question, you guys always do this tap dance of inserting words I didn't say in order to massage your position. Is there any reasonable conclusion about the cause that one can make based on the fact that we do not have a current materialistic explanation?
I would say so, yes.
What conclusion, then, do you think is reasonable based on not having a materialistic explanation?
So when looking at this, right, from my point of view, the possible explanations categorically would either be materialistic or supernatural. And so I could posit that we don't know. We don't have a materialistic explanation yet. Science may one day explain that. Or I could say, I don't know. We don't have a materialistic explanation yet. God may be the explanation. In both situations, you're committing a gaps type of fallacy. And
you are committing a gaps. You are committing a gaps type of fallacy. Why didn't you just start after the first three words? I don't know. How did you rule out? How did you rule out all other materialistic explanations that we don't know and aren't aware of yet? And what made you think it was justified to include a being for which no possibility of its existence has ever been demonstrated?
I'm more so positing that this particular piece of that line of evidence is evidence for a non-physical existence. I wouldn't necessarily jump to.
See, Clay, stop. This is the bullshit tap dancing that you and others keep doing. I asked a very straightforward question. And when you don't like the fact that I said, what made you count God as a possible explanation, you then reworded it to, well, I'm just saying that a non-materialistic explanation is possible. Okay. What made you think a non-materialistic explanation is possible? Where is the demonstration that something other than materialistic explanations is possible? Where is that demonstration?
Right. So with this particular evidence, the persistence of consciousness beyond the physical life.
No.
Beyond the physical existence of a body, of a conscious body. And consciousness in areas of the world that
it doesn't for this
where the physical body is.
I was asking a general question, but also in this specific situation, you do not have any evidential warrant to say that there is that supernatural is a candidate explanation for anything. No one has ever demonstrated that the supernatural is possible. No one has ever demonstrated that the supernatural can in fact interact with the material world in any detectable way. It has never happened. And what you're doing is saying, hey, we don't have a materialistic explanation, so I think a supernatural one should be included. Well, tough shit. You don't get to
You're
include it.
correct. So I hear what you're saying. So, but what I
Why did you interrupt me when I was still fucking talking? You don't get to do. You don't get. No, you didn't. You don't get to fucking do that. You don't get to just do a God of the gaps. My answer is we don't have a current materialistic explanation. Let's keep looking. And it's not we don't have a current materialistic explanation. It's we don't currently know what caused this. Let's keep looking. But you are like, hey, we don't have a materialistic explanation, and this doesn't make sense to me when I have no expertise on how the brain works or anything else. So I'm going to leap to a supernatural as a possible. Well, you don't get to do that. No. You have to demonstrate possibility. You don't get to assert possibility based on an argument from ignorance or incredulity fallacy.
I totally hear you.
And yet it didn't.
What I'm saying is, what's that?
And yet it didn't change your mind, did it?
Well, no. If I can just respond real quick, if that's all right. So what I would say is that these don't necessarily prove with certainty the existence of the supernatural realm. What I'm saying is,
I'm going to mute you before I scream at you for being a dishonest fuck. At no point did I say prove or absolute certainty. I'm the guy that doesn't think absolute certainty is possible. And I also just corrected you a few minutes ago on this thing about prove and, for absolute certainty. No, reasonable explanation. And my question was, how do you justify including something as a candidate explanation? How dare you dance away from the obvious trap that you walked into by trying to repaint this as prove and absolute certainty? That will never work. Try again. How do you show that the supernatural is a candidate explanation?
So if you exclude a possibility, that indicates bias. So if
no, sir.
Look at this,
I'm going to mute you again. I asked, how do you prove, how do you demonstrate, how do you show that the supernatural is a candidate explanation? If you mischaracterize my position one more fucking time, I will drop you and go on to another caller who can be honest, because I didn't say a single word about excluding the supernatural. I have not excluded the supernatural. I just have not yet included it as a candidate explanation, because candidate explanations need to be demonstrated. You have taken everything I've said and tried to flip it to prove absolute certainty. You're ruling out the supernatural. You have a bias. My bias is toward truth and reason. Please stick with that and explain what reasonable justification we could possibly have, last chance, to include the supernatural as a candidate explanation for anything. Last chance.
Before you dump him, though, I do have one question I would love to ask, but go ahead, Clay. Please answer his question.
Well, I'd actually prefer to engage with you just in case I do get dumped. I'm curious what your question is.
Okay, I'm going to mute you for a second. And despite the fact, Clay, that fuck you, you don't get to decide, I'm going to go ahead and let you do that. Because I am sick to death of you taking what I say and inverting it in order to make a dishonest point, in order to lie to yourself. But since you'd rather interact with Mr. Deity, I'm going to do that. Not for you, but I'm going to do it for my friend who just had to sit here while I went on fucking rant after rant exposing your nonsense. So I'm going to do this because Brian wants to. And when he's done with you, you're getting dropped like a hot fucking rock. Here we go. Clay, you're on with Brian.
So Clay, basically your near-death thing basically comes down to because magic. I mean, that's in essence what all of this is, because magic. But aren't there just infinitely simpler ways for God to demonstrate his magic and his powers? He's got people here who, are supposed to be his followers, who he said already, I would give you supernatural powers. You'll be able to do greater work than I do. Wouldn't he just do that? Instead of making us float the ceiling of the hospital where we're at and see the numbers on the thing. I mean, there's just so many easy ways, and he used to do it all the time back before the fact checkers came in. He used to do it all the time. Big miracles, raising the dead. healing the blind, walking on water. There's just so much stuff that he could do. But this is the thing that you're hanging your hat on? That somebody dies, and weird experiences.
No. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, this alone is definitely not what I'm hanging my hat on. It was more of just a curiosity about your guys' take. But I would say, in response to what you're talking about, it kind of goes along the lines of the hiddenness of God issue. But I'd say that if he were to expose himself in that way via miracles, at a certain point, the element of free choice would no longer exist. If God were to sit in your back pocket, constantly be knocking on the door, it's more of harassment rather than free choice. Yeah. And so I think, well, for a human being, what's that? Sorry, go ahead. My apologies.
I'm sorry, I need to mute.
How rude of him to take all the free will and free choice from all those people that Jesus did miracles in front of and God did back in the old days. Gee, what a prick. I mean, taking people's free choice like that left and right all the time is just awful. Horrible.
Yeah, no. So case dependent. Obviously, I'm not God. I don't know. I don't necessarily have the answers to why. Sorry, am I muted still?
No. Hello? I can hear you. I said that's called special pleading.
Right. Well, so if an infinite God does in fact exist, though, then by nature, as a finite human being, there is going to be a gap in knowledge. And so for me to claim that to be able to explain all of what an infinite God is or would be, wouldn't be an honest claim. So instead, I try to start from a position of acknowledging all possibilities, theistic ones, atheistic ones, materialistic, humanist, whatever it is, all possible explanations for reality. And then I explore different questions and hypotheses. To go back to kind of what was being discussed before, I don't know if I need to prove that a possibility is possible in order to include it as a possibility. If I'm going to analyze a question honestly, right, and eliminate all possible biases. So that'd be my response to that. But yeah.
Yeah, you've got a God here who supposedly loves everybody, wants everyone to be saved. There's so many easy ways. I mean, he could, after the fact, he could say, "Oh well, I know that I took away your free choice, so now I'm giving you free choice to choose again." Or so, there's so many ways that this could be just so easy. He's an infinitely wise and knowledgeable being who understands how everything works and how we're all made. He made us to be the exact way that we are so that we would do the things that we do, because we've always been doing them in his mind for all eternity. That's what all knowing is all about. But somehow he just can't figure out how to get us some clear evidence of his existence and his power and all of that stuff. At least not now that we have things like cameras and fact checkers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
He used to do it all the time, right. But somehow, maybe he ran out of miracles in the world. He would just not have the budget for it anymore.
Yeah. Well, to go back to what I was saying before, just that clarification about evidence, you mentioned that there is an evidence. I would say that there is evidence that maybe you are convinced by. Like, I would say there's evidence for Bigfoot, right? I'm not convinced by it, but technically it exists, and I'm just not convinced by it. So there is evidence for God. It's just not necessarily convincing, obviously, for the atheist. As far as, like, I would say, look, you're right. I don't know when it comes to some of the things that you put forth, but I do think it's possible that there's more to the answer as far as allowing us the opportunity to come to him than what we would even be aware of, right? So one thing, and I'm not a universalist per se, I'm not a universalist, but like one possibility that's kind of not really talked about in the Bible, there is a possibility that, and again, it's not biblical, but there's a possibility that we are presented with a choice after we die, right? In a little bit of a chance. Hey, I'm God. I'm here. Do you want me? Right. So I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, wouldn't you? Yeah.
Right. Yes.
So, everything's a possibility if you don't ever fucking have to demonstrate possibility. I don't give a shit what you think is possible if your foundation is you don't think possibility needs to be demonstrated. Why the fuck are you spending time talking about what you think is possible in order to justify God if you don't think you need to justify possibility? Just skip to the finish and say you don't need to justify your fucking God belief.
Yeah, it's just a point of orientation. So you start from the top, right? So if you find evidence for God at the top, and I think, if I find that evidence personally convincing, right, then these other possibilities that I don't yet have confirmation of are on the table. So to go back to what I was saying before, if there's evidence for an infinite God, and I'm personally convinced by that, then I would be personally convinced by the reality that there's going to be a limited understanding that I have with my finite knowledge, right? And so, of course, at that point, there would be possibilities for things that I yet to have an explanation for, right?
No, there wouldn't.
So
possibilities don't change. I'll shut up, Brian. I'm told.
Clay, in the last 400 years, we have gained so much knowledge about the physical world, the material world. We know all kinds of things that we can demonstrate, that we can make predictions with, that are, if you get into the quantum realm, they're so refined, the predictability of things. But we've been able to do all kinds of things where we can land a probe on a comet. We can put men on the moon. We can cure diseases. We can do all these things. Do you realize that in the last 4,000 years, there is absolutely nothing we know about God that shepherds in the field didn't claim they knew?
Well, so I guess it sounds like you're possibly requesting evidence that would be within the material realm to explain a God that's beyond the material realm. And maybe I'm wrong about that.
We're here in the material realm, and he used to do that kind of thing all the time. Yeah. I'm asking him to be God and do what God
in the form
does or did.
Well, so I would claim that he did in the form of Jesus, right? So like that's obviously my claim. So then I'd have to look at the evidence for Jesus.
But I
will also say there are certain issues. Yeah.
Clay, God had 13.8 billion years to put that whole thing together, right? He knew that this was going to be the only event in human history which had any meaning whatsoever. The life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And he couldn't even leave us with an eyewitness to the event, a single eyewitness to the event. Is this the plan of a brilliant God who loves us and wants us to be saved? Leaves us with writings from people who weren't there, written 40 to 60 to 70 years later, based on word of mouth accounts? I mean, it's insanity.
Right. So we can dive into those particulars a little bit later if we have time for it. But I would say that I would.
You won't.
I would posit, right, as somebody who's convinced, as somebody who's a theist, I would posit that because I am convinced, right, and obviously every Christian is convinced and every Muslim is convinced, right, that there is evidence, there's information to point to a position being true for a creator God. And so at that point, the question becomes, okay, if there's evidence for that, even though I know you guys aren't convinced, but the question is, if there's evidence for that, then what is the evidence or information for each individual worldview? And so I don't necessarily, like, for myself, with my own exploration, I don't have to prove with absolute certainty that Jesus came, died, rose again.
Say absolute certainty one more fucking time, I dare you.
I didn't know you were talking. My apologies. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I wasn't talking. I was interrupted. I said, say absolute certainty one more fucking time, I dare you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So all I need to do is indicate to myself that the most likely worldview is Christianity compared to the others. If I am at first convinced that there is a infinite creator God of the universe. So that's the primary question that I would focus on as an atheist first would be, well, what is the information to indicate something beyond the material? And I
but even if
about on Monday.
Clay,
what's that?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I thought you'd hit a break point. Even if a creator God exists, we clearly have absolutely no way, if we're going to use absolutely, to know absolutely anything about him with that's reliable, that's demonstrable, that's repeatable. There's literally nothing we can know about this being, which is why you have so many different interpretations of both God and then even within religion. This statistic always cracks me up. I can't remember how many world religions there are, but there are actually more branches of Christianity than there are world religions, which suggests that if you have a book which is supposedly inspired and given to us by that creator, you're going to have more dissension and more confusion than if you just left us all alone. There's nothing we can know about this being. So why do you care?
So I would say, though, that the ability to have demonstrable, repeatable, reliable information does point to something transcendent. Like, that's my position. I know it's not your guys's, but like that. So
and that information,
to say that God would have to fit inside of a realm in which I could repeatably, reliably, and demonstrably demonstrate his existence would go against his very nature, first and foremost, but it would also, like I said, go against the element and necessity of having a choice to choose him and therefore to have a love-based relationship with him. So that would be my answer as to why I don't think God needs to be repeatable, demonstrable, reliable in that sense. I would say that the things within this realm point to him, including repeatability, demonstrability, and reliability. And so, that would be my claim there.
Can you prove it?
Okay,
or are you just going to assert that one like the other like possibility that you don't have to prove it?
Well, neither one of us can prove our worldview with certainty, right? As we talked about earlier.
Goodbye, you dishonest fucking piece of garbage. I didn't say anything. You made a fucking assertion, and I asked you if you were going to prove it or just leave it hanging there unproven like you did for possibility. And what was your answer? Neither one of us can prove our worldview. You're not interested. You're not interested. Okay. You don't even know what your own assertion was. You just called it your fucking assertion, and you don't know what it was, and you're not going to defend it, and you're going to pull some bullshit. Goodbye, Clay. Don't call me again. I am exhausted by these time-wasting fake apologists with a conclusion in search of support. Only Clay has a conclusion we don't need to support. I just think I get to count something as a possibility, even if it's not demonstrated. Well, why not count God without demonstrating it? Oh, because that's not as convincing. So if I convince you that there's a possibility of God, then that slippery slope leads directly to Jesus caring whose dick I suck. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it is dishonest at every single opportunity. Well, I can't prove it with absolute certainty. Well, neither of us can prove our word. Yes, I can't prove there isn't a God, and you can't prove there is a God. Congratulations. Which position is rational? The one that believes there is when it can't be proven, or the one that does not believe there is when it can't be proven? This one, motherfucker, this is the rational position. To withhold your conclusion, to not become convinced until the evidence is sufficient to convince. And you smuggle all this stuff in, the number of notes I had about how many times prove this, absolutely. Oh, well, God can't reveal himself because that would end free will. No, it fucking wouldn't. God could walk in this room right now and say, I am the God of the Bible, and all of these things that are true. And I would look at him and say, fuck you. I'm not going to worship you. I believe you're real, but I will not worship you. If you are that character that okayed slavery, that marginalized people based on their gender, that don't allow women equality or property. There's nothing about Trump as president. I'm completely convinced that Trump is a president. Fuck him. I'm not going to vote for him or support him or agree with him unless he's right. If he's right, I'll agree with him. Hell, I agreed with Josh Hawley, who is an absolute fucking douche nozzle. But he was pointing out the Facebook whistleblower stuff about how Facebook is selling us all to China. Josh Hawley did something correct and true and good. Thank you, Josh Hawley.
Yep.
for being less of an obnoxious dipshit than you normally are. It is bizarre. The excuses that Clay and others, well, every time you bring up a problem, it's, God can't reveal himself because that would just eliminate free will. It'd be like nagging you. Okay, you know what I do to people who nag me? I fucking hang up on them. It's done. Oh, well,
and how
can
is
you prove it?
providing evidence?
Yeah, go ahead.
How is providing evidence of your existence more of a hit to your free will than the threat of eternal conscious torment? I mean, if you tell me, well, if you don't believe in me, your things are going to be bad. I guess I'll believe in you then. If I really believe that were a possibility, I might just believe. I might say I believe because I don't want to be tortured forever. There goes my free will right out the window. It's all so silly. And forget the fact that there's no evidence that we have free will in the first place, but that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, the one thing is that Clay is exhausting because he's a relatively smart guy who has managed to convince himself of relatively stupid things. Yeah. Like, I don't need to demonstrate possibility. Or if I can't be absolutely certain, I might as well just guess and go with it. If it feels good, if I'm convinced of it, hey, there's a bunch of other people who did it too, Right. It doesn't make sense that God's hiding, but, maybe God's got a reason. This parade of here's what all the excuses I'm going to make to keep justifying my completely unwarranted belief. Clay has zero evidence that a God is even possible, and yet counts it as a possibility because he looks at evidence and decides, this evidence is evidence for God, but it's not. See, when he tried to portray this as, we both have a bias. He has a bias towards God. We have a bias against God. No, I fucking don't. I have a bias for truth and the best methods of finding it. Right. You have a bias for God, right, and you are admitting it and trying to excuse it because it's the position that you find compelling.